Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer le'olam, hachol ve'hayam, rishrush shel hamayim, berak hashamayim, tfilat ha'adam, chachol ve'hayam, rishrush shel hamayim, berak hashamayim, tfilat ha'adam. My God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the water, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the water, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart. These famous words by Hannah Senesh begin us off with a moment of meditation, of prayer, of meaning. Hannah Senesh was a partisan who certainly saw her fair share of horror and tragedy during the wartime, but she still found it in her soul to compose these beautiful words among so many others. So we certainly draw our inspiration from her spirit, her bravery, her courage, as we gather here tonight. I'm Cantor Sydney Michaely, and I'm really honored to be part of this commemoration of Yom Hashoah, which begins tonight, the Jewish day in our Jewish calendar for marking Holocaust remembrance. We have another one in our American or national calendar, international calendar, but this is the one we can really hold dear and sacred as a community. I'm representing all of our clergy. We are far-flung today. Many of our team are in New York at the ordination of new rabbis and cantors from our community. Another rabbi, Rabbi Stein, is on a temple trip. Rabbi Sachs is still with our confirmation class where I just came from. So Judaism is alive and well, even in these sometimes troubling moments. The fact that all of your clergy are in different places tonight, I think can give us a spark of joy and of hope as we're part of different meaningful moments for different people in our community. This is my first year in our community, and of course, I've learned about Laszlo Berkowitz, may his memory be for a blessing, the founder of this synagogue, the founder of this amazing place, who of course was a Holocaust survivor who brought his whole self and his whole soul to this community. I'm sad I never got to know him, but I do feel like I get to know him through so many of you, through the other clergy, and through these important stories that he brought with him and shared with this community. So I look forward to getting to know him more through all of you during these coming years. It's really important that we've gathered here tonight. I'm grateful for all of you for being here as we remember the lives of the 6 million who perished during the Shoah, as well as celebrate those who showed resistance and bravery and perseverance and survived or made attempts at survival or resistance during these terrible times. It's important now more than ever, as survivors are fewer and fewer in our midst, to really carry these stories forward. It's all of us. It's our sacred duty and something we should really take upon ourselves. So I appreciate all of you being here tonight. We also are really fortunate to be joined after this small ceremony, this small tekis. We have a presentation and Q&A with Dr. Kiera Krago-Schneider. Thank you so much for being here. She's a Temple member, she's a wonderful scholar, and she works at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and she'll be able to teach us a lot tonight. So I know she'll tell us a little bit more about herself and her area of study and what she's going to share with us, but we're just so grateful to have you not just as a scholar in our community, but also as a member in our community. Speaking of the importance of legacy and carrying forward, we have a very important tent here at Temple Road of Shalom, and it's the 2G and 3G tent, those who are second and third generation of folks who experienced the Holocaust, survivors, folks who experienced the Holocaust in some way. And so now as we sing Ani Ma'amin, these sacred words that were sung by Jews all over Europe as they marched, some to work camps, some to death camps. I'll invite all of them to come up and light 6 candles in honor of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Shoah. And if you'd like to, you can read a bit about each of their stories and their connection to the Shoah in your program. Thank you so much, everybody. And as they return to their seats, I'll invite everyone to rise as they're able. We'll share a prayer of remembrance, El Malei Rachamim, and then I'll invite anyone who tonight is remembering someone who was lost in the Shoah to share their name before continuing with Kaddish. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bameromim, Hametzei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, B'ma'alot Kedushim Udhorim, Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim, Lenishmot, Kol Acheinu B'nei Yisrael, Shenitbechu B'Shoah, Anashim, Nashim, V'Taf, Shenechneku, V'Shenisrefu, V'Shenehergu, Shemasru et Nafsham et Al Kiddush Hashem, Began Eden Tehei Menuchatam, Ana Ba'al Harachamim, Hastireihem B'Seiter Knafecha Le'olamim, לצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר Amen. To our fully compassionate God on high, to our 6 million beloved siblings murdered because they were Jews, to all the souls of our holy and pure loved ones whose blood was spilt, grant clear and certain rest with you in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure, whose brightness shines like the very glow of heaven. Forever enfold them in the embrace of your wings, secure their souls in eternity. Adonai, they are yours. They will rest in peace. And together we say, Amen. I'll now go around the room, and if you have anyone you'd like to mention out loud or quietly in your heart, someone you're thinking of this evening, I'll invite you to do so.
Nellie Deutsch and Erica Credo.
To the hundreds of members of my parents' family, the Gardiner Matafia family of Paul.
My Aitz's family, or Aich's family, which is now Tulsi Ukraine, and my Immerman family, that's west of Riga, in what's now Latvia, and my Kalvariski family, which is in a small town west of Vilna.
And Frank and all those who were in hiding with her.
I invite you, if you're comfortable, to recite Kaddish Yatom. Yitgadal Bidkadash Me'raba Be'alma Divrach Hirutei V'yamlich Malchutei B'chayachon Uvyomechon Uvchaye Dechol Beit Yisrael Ba'agala Uvizman Kariv V'imru Amen Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivarach Le'olam U'lamei Almaya Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitromam V'yitnaseh V'yit hadar, v'yit aleh, v'yit halal, shmei kudsha brichu, le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechamata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlam min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, V'imru Amen. Are there any names I missed going around the first time?
Yes, I have my parents are survivors of my aunts, uncles, grandparents, sister.
Thank you. Anyone else I missed?
My two brothers, Manya and Shimon Feder.
May all their memories be a blessing. O say shalom bimromav, huya ase shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imeru amen. I thank you all for joining me in this short but very meaningful ceremony of remembrance. I hope it brought something to you. And now again, thank you so much, Dr. Craig Schneider. We're so lucky to hear from you tonight. I'll invite you to take the bima. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Just a little bit about me. My family moved here about 8 years ago from California. We left all of our family behind so that I could come and work at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and we became members of this shul when the girls were 5, so maybe 7 or 8 years ago. They started at religious school. I started teaching religious school. We all three continue to do that. Their bat mitzvah will be in December, so they will have to decide if they want to keep coming or how they want to be involved. I came to this topic by a very circuitous route. I was told from a very young age that I was going to be a PhD in history. It was my dad's dream, and then it passed on to all 3 of his kids, who actually all have BAs in history. But he wanted me to be an American historian, and that just wasn't my jam. So I thought I was going to be a historian of Israel. And then I met a friend of mine's grandmother who had lived in a displaced persons camp, and I realized that despite my degrees in religious studies, in European history, and in Jewish studies, I had no idea about the DP centers. What I was taught, and I will date myself quite a while ago, was that the war ended and then the state of Israel and everybody went on with their lives, and that's not actually the case. So today I want to share with you guys a bit about what happens to survivors in the immediate post-war period. I'm looking specifically at Germany, but I can talk about other countries as well. And so just before we jump in, I want to begin by thanking Cookie Mandel for inviting me to come and talk to you guys. And I really want to thank Cantor Michaeli, for introducing me and being here tonight, and Jordan Berry, who tonight will take your questions. Without you guys, obviously, I would not be here. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for being here on Yom Hashoah to discuss stateless DPs in the post-war world. I welcome questions at the end of the discussion and look forward to introducing this topic to all of you. So this one's not working, but this one is. I have a bunch of slides. Okay, before I dive into, give me 1 second, because I think this might actually.
I think that other screen is the bulb went out, so.
Oh, okay.
Don't worry about it, we can all see from this one.
Let me just really quickly make sure I have the right slide set open, because they correspond with the discussion. So just give me 1 second. It should be this one. Oh, okay, it's a little, okay, let's see. All right. Put it here so you guys know what we're going to talk about. Okay, so before I dive into the history of displaced persons, or DPs, I want to make a few notes. My first point is about statistics. So I'm sure that many of you can imagine the chaos of the post-war, but record keeping as far as it concerned displaced persons in this period was rough guessing at best. And that is because people were constantly moving in search of their families. Camp residents would be in one center and they'd decide they wanted to go to a different center, but they didn't sign out, right? They just got a new card at another center. Names were translated into English characters differently, depending on who was going to be, who's writing out your CM1 card. And the general data collection meant really there are no solid, reliable statistics for the numbers of DPs in the post-war. And this is especially true for Jews, because Jewish DPs would travel hundreds of miles at the drop of a dime if they heard a rumor that they might have surviving family somewhere. And so what you had was Jews who would travel to Lvov, and then they'd come back and settle in a different center, or maybe they'd bring their family members back with them. The statistics that I provide here today are most often cited in this work, and they're as close to the actual number as we have gotten so far. Additionally, I will focus on the study of displaced persons living in the American zone of occupied Germany. So my lecture will specifically focus on those relationships and experiences. But that having said, I will give you some numbers about the general DP population. And if you have any questions about the French zone, the British zone, or the Soviet zone, I can definitely address those. So displacement was a fact of post-war life in Europe. More than 30 million people had been uprooted by the Third Reich and Stalin's regime between 1939 and 1945, mainly to achieve Hitler's and the Nazis' vision of a pure racial state. Most of those displaced sought to return to their pre-war countries of origin in the days, weeks, and months after the westward advance of the Red Army and the German surrender in May 1945. While returning home and resuming their interrupted lives were the primary goals of most uprooted people in the wake of the war, an estimated 12 million Volksdeutsche, or ethnic Germans, uprooted themselves as the war shifted course for fear of retaliatory actions. And these are Volksdeutsche making their way into Germany. These people joined an estimated 8 million refugees who remained in occupied Germany and were classified as United Nations Displaced Persons, or UNDPs. I will just use DPs for short. Of the total of the DP population, only an estimated 2% were Shoah survivors in the summer of 1945. Allied and United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, efforts to resettle as many refugees in their pre-war homes as quickly as possible resulted in the reparation of up to almost 7 million DPs in the summer and fall of 1945. And these are reparation trains, not Jewish reparation trains, which I will discuss in a minute, but these are other displaced persons being returned to their homes. This left an estimated 1 million displaced persons living in Germany in early 1946, often referred to as the last million. Although Jewish DPs had initially constituted only a small minority of the overall DP population, their numbers grew rapidly in 1946 and 47 as hundreds of thousands of survivors fled westward into occupied Germany seeking asylum and a chance to emigrate abroad. This influx of Jews who were later granted DP status increased the number of displaced Jews in Germany to somewhere around 20% of the total DP population. And it actually changed the demographic of the Jewish DP community. The estimated 90,000 Jews liberated in Germany after living in hiding, in privileged mixed marriages, or after having survived concentration camps and the death marches from the East became the responsibility of the Allied forces in the 4 respective zones of occupation, as well as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. The number of Jewish survivors dropped sharply in the first weeks after liberation as tens of thousands died from the long-term effects of starvation and diseases such as tuberculosis, cholera, and typhus. Despite the best efforts of Allied doctors, some 4 out of every 10 liberated Jews died soon after their emancipation, leaving between 60 and 70,000 Shoah survivors in Germany in the late spring of 1945. Like other DPs, these Jews faced the choice of either remaining in Germany or attempting to return to the places of their exile. More than 2/3 of the Jews liberated in Germany chose to walk, board the few operating trains, or beg for rides on military lorries in an effort to get back to their former homes. While repatriation, resettlement, and reintegration were possibilities for Jews from Western Europe, this was rarely the case for Jews from the East, who met with extreme and often violent anti-Semitic pogroms upon their return. The worst of these pogroms, or violent massacres, occurred on July 3rd, 1946, in Kielce, Poland, where 42 survivors were murdered and a further 40 were injured. At the same time, Allied occupation and laws against the expression of anti-Semitism made Western Germany a relatively safe haven. Recognizing this, many East European survivors fled westward upon learning their family members had been murdered, there was little chance of regaining stolen property, and that they faced violence should they remain in the East. This westward migration in the summer and fall of 1946-47, combined with the estimated 36,000 Jews who chose to remain in Germany upon their liberation, and the thousands too ill to attempt to return to their pre-war homes, presented the Allies and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration with a task they had not anticipated and were unprepared to tackle. And when you read reports from the UNRWA, people often say, why wouldn't they just want to go home? Everybody wants to go home. So it was with shock that they met Jews who refused to return. It was the foresight of 44 cooperating nations that led to the creation of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, in 1943. Dedicated to the aid of Allied European countries in need and the care of refugees under Allied control at the end of the war, these countries pledged to provide resources, supplies, and aid workers to help care for refugees and rebuild Europe in the wake of the war. The leaders of the organization declared their intent to care for the mental and physical needs of the refugees under its control. However, the actual plans decided between November 9th, 1943 and May 8th, 1945 were inaccurate for the situation they faced. They had been based on incorrect information relating to refugees and their needs and were woefully insufficient for the actual number of displaced persons in post-war Europe. And this is FDR signing UNRWA into existence. Additionally, the caregivers sent over by UNRWA were wholly unprepared to deal with traumatized masses, and they could not understand why some DPs refused to return to their former home countries. It took little time for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, or SHAEF, the combined Allied forces in control of occupied Europe in the spring of 45, to realize that UNRWA was overwhelmed by the task of caring for the millions of displaced they faced at war's end. Instead, it was the responsibility of the occupation governments in each zone and the troops on the ground to care for, house, control, and supply Germany's displaced peoples. This meant that young men trained to fight and kill the enemy were essentially tasked with acting as social workers right after the war. Despite the aforementioned obstacles, UNRWA was able to take over control of DP camps in October 1945, and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee began working in these centers in late summer 1945, which led to a status quo of sorts across all the camps. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the post-war situation was again sent into chaos with the arrival of upwards of 250,000 European Jewish survivors in Allied-occupied West Germany in 46 and 47. Known as infiltrees, most of these Jews had lived out their wartime existence in the furthest reaches of the Soviet Union. While the Office of the Military Government U.S. was willing to allow some 200,000 of these Jews into its zone and accept responsibility for housing them, the infiltrees were not initially granted DP status. They were considered refugees. After months of overcrowding and waiting, these infiltrees were also designated as DPs and joined the million Jewish and non-Jewish DPs in Germany seeking UNRWA care. So now you have a lot more people who need very limited resources. First contact with Shoah survivors left liberating soldiers and UNRWA aid workers grappling with feelings of disbelief, distress, and disgust at the overwhelming evidence of death and destruction. Makeshift hospital rooms were filled with bunks of patients on the brink of death, and starvation continued to plague these victims. The care for emaciated, ill, and injured survivors was among the highest priorities facing Allied troops. Initially treated by Allied doctors and members of the Red Cross on site, often in concentration camp infirmaries, survivors needed more care than this provided them. The severe medical state led members of SHAEF to requisition hospitals, like the one that you can see on the screen, and sanatoria to attend to those needing long-term medical help. Finding appropriate facilities was only one issue SHAEF faced. With too few qualified, capable medical professionals among Allied military forces and the Red Cross in Germany, SHAEF looked for other means to meet survivors' medical needs. They soon required German doctors and nurses to care for the very people their country had tried to eradicate. St. Ottilien, which is on the screen, hospital is located in Emming, Germany, and it opened to Shoah survivors in late April 1945. The majority of its patients came from the Kaufering concentration camp, a subcamp of Dachau. Its medical staff largely consisted of Germans who had worked in the facility when it operated as a military hospital before the spring of 1945. This was also the case in the Gauting Sanatorium, one of the largest institutions in southern Bavaria, which had acted as a Wehrmacht hospital during the war and employed many convinced Nazis. The sanatorium began admitting Shoah survivors in summer 1945, housing more than 600 patients at its peak. Most had tuberculosis, rampant throughout post-war Europe. They remained in Gauting until they were deemed fully recovered, at which point they were settled in neighboring displaced persons centers. The Allies requisitioned hundreds of facilities like St. Ottilien and Gauting throughout Germany and co-opted the staff to treat surviving Jews. Survivors healthy enough for release and those with chronic but not life-threatening or contagious illness were treated at hospitals in their DP camps, such as the one located in Fernwald. The DPs living in centers without medical facilities were seen by doctors and nurses who came to the camps on regular rotations employed by UNRWA and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or by German doctors in neighboring towns. Although many Shoah survivors in Germany required medical care upon liberation, most were well enough to settle outside of concentration camps as soon as housing became available, and some became squatters while awaiting directions on where they should go after their liberation. But housing shortages plagued UMGS, the Office of Military Government U.S., for years. Western Allied bombing campaigns in 1944 and 45 left entire German cities in rubble, and an estimated 25 million Germans homeless. Finding adequate housing for Shoah survivors was neither a priority nor an easy task for UMGS. occupation troops were forced to use any viable housing facilities. So barracks like the one that you see here, Hitler Youth summer camps, lean-tos, and complexes built to house voluntary workers and their families during the war became sites for DP centers. So really the quality of your housing depended on where you were placed or where you were liberated. The lucky DP had a blanket to demarcate their space from that of strangers. There was often only one bathroom for several families and a shared mess hall. These buildings were initially behind barbed wire and encircled by armed guards because General George S. Patton was anti-Semitic and worried about the safety of Germans at the hands of survivors. I just want us to all take a moment to think about that Patton feared persecuted Jews would murder good Germans and so continued to keep DPs captive with armed soldiers instructed to shoot anyone trying to leave the camp without permission. The first residents were DPs from across Europe, not solely Jewish survivors. All DPs were classified according to nationality, including many Jews who no longer identified with their former citizenship stripped from them during the Shoah. Many of these survivors demanded recognition as Jews. Ignoring their pleas, the Americans, as had the British and the French, separated all DPs into national groups regardless of their war experiences and forced Jewish survivors to live with non-Jewish DPs who had subscribed to virulent anti-Semitism, were sometimes collaborators, and on occasion Nazis. Further complicating the situation were major food and clothing shortages that persisted into 1947. News about the dire situation of the Shoah survivors in the American zone of occupation reached President Harry S. Truman in the summer of 1945. After deliberation and pressure from American Jewish communities, Truman agreed to send an American commission under the direction of Earl G. Harrison. Harrison arrived in Germany in June 1945 to, quote, ascertain the needs of the stateless and non-repatriatables, particularly Jews, among the displaced persons in Germany, and to what extent those needs are being provided at present by military authorities, international and national private organizations, end quote. And as you can see, Harrison wrote scathingly about the treatment of Jews under American control. The delegation's published findings of the subsequent Harrison report propelled UMGIS to make sweeping changes to how Jewish survivors in the American zone were treated. These included the designation of several Jews-only displaced person centers, an increase in the amount of food allotted to Jewish survivors, and an American push to open the gates of Palestine. I think it is important to note that none of these changes were implemented in any other zone, mainly for political reasons. Now, President Truman directed immediate changes in the care, control, and treatment of Jewish displaced persons even before the Harrison Report recommendations had been formally issued. Harrison felt it was necessary to send over his initial findings so that Truman could get on top of them right away. Truman realized that they made him and the U.S. look incredibly bad, and he moved quickly. He ordered General Eisenhower, in his capacity as military governor of the U.S. zone of occupation, to improve the conditions of the DPs, formally taking on this task on August 10th, 1945. Eisenhower notified the State Department that any Jewish displaced person who did not wish to be repatriated would be moved into a Jews-only camp. These camps were to be run by UNRWA with the help of outside Jewish aid organizations, such as the JDC, HIAS, and New Americans, which would work directly with the Jewish camp inhabitants themselves. Eisenhower also ordered all of his officers to requisition any supplies from Germans needed to raise the standard of living in the camps to the level of individuals living outside of the centers. And this meant that they literally went door to door and said, oh, we're taking your oven. So in some cases, they would take over houses in order to make equal living environments. He also required his senior officers to visit the camps on a regular basis, and he approved the suggestion of Rabbi Stephen Wise, an advisor to the president on post-war refugee affairs, to appoint a Jewish advisor to the United States European Command. This person was an intermediary who would meet with the DPs and report their needs and concerns to UMGIS. Finally, Eisenhower removed the armed guards from the Jews-only camps and replaced them with internal security composed entirely of Jewish police officers under UMGIS control. It was clear to Jewish DPs, the three Western Allied powers, and the international aid organizations caring for survivors that the DP camp system in Germany was temporary. However, no immigration solutions presented themselves, and very few survivors were resettled in the first 3 post-war years. When American surveys asked survivors about their resettlement hopes, the response was almost universally that Palestine was the first choice for immigration. Their second choice was the crematoria, because almost all survivors agreed that there was a need for a Jewish state that could protect its citizens. However, the British continued to keep strict immigration laws in place, going as far as imprisoning undocumented immigrants in concentration camps on the island of Cyprus. Additionally, the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and several countries in South America continued to be largely closed to this population. The UN Declaration to Divide Palestine in 1947 and the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948 boosted the spirits of many DPs who believed their time in camps had finally come to an end. However, in a meeting on May 4th, 1948, just days before the establishment of Israel, a number of American Jewish leaders, as well as many prominent officials from the Yishuv, or Jewish settlement in Palestine, came together to discuss the resettlement of Jewish DPs. At this meeting, Nahum Goldman of the Jewish Agency noted that the survivors were not, quote, the human material Eretz Yisrael needed, end quote. Although the creation of the State of Israel gave Jews a viable immigration option, it did not solve the DP problem in occupied Germany. The immediate outbreak of war in Israel, combined with the logistical issues that accompanied mass emigration and resettlement, made resettlement incredibly difficult. So much so that it took until 1952 for the majority of Jews who would settle in Israel, somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of the DP population, to finally reach their destination. And it was not until 1955 that Israel began accepting large numbers of elderly, infirm, and family units into the country. While Israel was universally declared the most sought-after site of immigration by and for survivors, and the country that took the highest number of DPs, it was not the only location where Jewish DPs wished to emigrate. For many, the United States acted as a beacon of hope for a new life away from the accursed soil of Europe. However, the U.S. remained largely closed to Jewish immigrants until 1950. President Truman had issued the Truman Directive in December 1945, which required that existing immigration quotas left unfilled by the war be designated for displaced persons. The directive did not lead to increased immigration quotas to the United States, and only an estimated 17,000 Jewish DPs qualified for U.S. immigration between 1946 and 1947. Like the United States, Canada, Australia, Argentina, South Africa, and several other countries remained closed to Jewish DPs. They just didn't feel like they were good immigrants. This changed in the U.S. in June 1948 when Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act, which drastically increased immigration for DPs in the U.S. zone by mortgaging future visas. However, the first iteration of the law was written to exclude most Jews, and the act was not amended until 1950. And what I mean by this is that if you had reached the U.S. zone before December 1945, you had an opportunity to come in under the DP Act, but all those infiltrees who had come in 46 and 47 were excluded. The Truman Directive and the DP Act allowed somewhere around 80,000 Jewish DPs to finally immigrate to the United States by 1958. Canada also accepted between 16,000 and 20,000 Jewish DPs during this period. Within Europe, Belgium took in about 8,000 Jewish DPs, and France admitted a further 2,000. Finally, an estimated 5,000 Jewish DPs settled in South Africa and Latin America. Along with those departing DPs went their former leadership, resulting in the dismantling of several DP organizations. The years between 1948 and 1952 are referred to by DP scholars as the Great Post-War Migration, and resulted in the resettlement of all but an estimated 2,000 Shoah survivors who were referred to as the, quote, hardcore. They were considered unattractive immigrants by the immigration boards in several countries because of their age, ill health, and, quote, moral turpitude. Although countries such as Israel would begin accepting these DPs after 1955, many of the hardcore refused to be resettled in any country but the United States, which remained closed to those who fell into the above-mentioned categories. The quickly diminishing number of DPs led to the consolidation of DP centers, finally resulting in one remaining camp by 1953, Fernwald. Just as mass immigration and camp consolidation were occurring, so too was the push by the Federal Republic of Germany and the United States to transfer control over all remaining DPs to the newly formed West German government in the hopes of eventually closing all remaining DP centers. The transfer took place on December 1st, 1951, much to the chagrin of the remaining Jewish DPs who vowed never again to be under the control of their former oppressors and those who had murdered their families. The status of the DPs changed with the transfer of control from displaced persons under American jurisdiction to Heimatlose Ausländer, or stateless foreigners under the West Germans. And I'm just going to use HA for short. With this change in status came many of the rights and responsibilities afforded to German citizens. Additionally, Jewish survivors lost their protected status under the Americans, which guaranteed the German police could not enter Jewish DP centers and that Jews be tried by American military courts and not in the German legal system. For their part, the German authorities met the calls and demands set forth for them by the Office of the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany and the JDC. Daily life was no worse under German control than it had been under that of the International Refugee Organization, which was the successor of UNRWA. The Bavarian government, which was responsible for the operation of Fürstenwald, worked hard to keep the stateless Jews in clean, well-kept facilities with adequate rations and provided immigration and integration grants for those who qualified. Although the German federal government wanted to close the remaining centers for HAs as quickly as possible, it was willing to work with the JDC and the Central Council of Jews in Germany to try to resettle as many Jews as abroad as possible. And part of this was that they didn't want any Jews to really remain in the country. However, nearly 6 years after securing power from the U.S. High Commissioner, the West German government still found itself caring for more than 1,000 Jewish HAs who either did not qualify for emigration or refused to resettle outside the camps. The fact that many HAs were ineligible for immigration meant that the situation in Germany remained at a standstill, occasionally punctuated by conflict. So this is an image of a German raid on illegal businesses on the Mühlstrasse. But when you read the reports, only Jewish store owners were pulled out for inspection, none of the Christian owners. So you can see there's conflict building. The interactions between German authorities and the displaced persons were generally amicable. However, when conflict arose, they erupted in violence. And the JDC was forced to mediate to help ease the tension. Now, although the creation of the State of Israel had reignited hope for their future resettlement among many Shoah survivors who remained in DP centers in Germany, it took less than a year before a new, unexpected wave of Jews began to trickle into the country and settle in American-run DP centers, mainly in Fürstenwald. These individuals had formerly been DPs but had been resettled abroad in North and South America, Australia, and especially in Israel. In a painfully ironic turn, they now left their new homelands to cross legally into Germany on passports marked, quote, not for use in Germany, end quote, demanding the return of their status as stateless people and their resettlement in a more favorable country than the one from where they had come. The returners cited several reasons for leaving Israel, including the climate, war, ill health, separation from family members, and their inability to adapt to the, quote, pioneer lifestyle. The prospect of restitution also drew a significant number back to Germany as the compensation negotiations between the Adenauer government and the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany were settled in 1952, and this is from that agreement. Residents in Germany made it easier for those seeking restitution to secure these funds. And when I say that, what I mean is that if you weren't in Germany, you almost never qualified for the funds unless you had a really amazing lawyer. Although the Israeli returnees gave several different reasons for their return, they all agreed that they had come back to Europe to find what they could not get in Israel: medical care, viable business opportunities, and a chance to emigrate elsewhere. The status of the first Israeli returnees to Germany fell into a, quote, gray zone, as they arrived in the country on passports marked invalid for travel in Germany, but with valid visas to enter Germany issued at German embassies in Rome and Paris. Additionally, the returnees who had emigrated after 1949 and entered Germany after the spring of 1951 did so under the provisions specified in the 1951 law on the legal status of stateless foreigners, which allowed stateless individuals who had formerly lived in Germany to return to the country within 2 years of their departure. So it was a murky return. The small group of returnees initially caused very little concern. However, the quick surge in their numbers began to cause problems in southern Bavaria, especially in Fernwald. There were an estimated 418 returnees living in the camp in June 1952, despite the official closure of the center to newcomers. This number grew to around 800 by August of 1953 and continued to climb. By the end of 1953, some 3,500 returnees had come through Fernwald, sparking a sense of urgency among both JDC and authorities from the Bavarian government, anxious to prevent further influx and to close the last remaining center. The flow of returnees increased so rapidly in the early 1950s that more entered Camp Fernwald every month than the number of Jews emigrating out. Fernwald's population was 1,800 in October 1952, of which an estimated 50% were believed to have been returnees, making them the single largest group in the camp. There was no existing protocol in place in Germany to deal with this embarrassing population because no one had ever anticipated that any of the resettled Jewish DPs would return to the country of their former oppressors. In a JDC report from August 2nd, 1954, the JDC country director for Germany noted that the returnees with whom he had met emphasized that they, quote, did not recognize that they were Israeli nationals. Instead, these Hosrim, which is the name they gave themselves, which literally means returnees, demanded the return of their papers that had identified them as stateless. The IRO and later the West German government, as well as the Jewish aid organizations, considered these returnees nationals of the countries they had left, regardless of the claims made by the returnees themselves. Discussions over the care of the returnee population took place among every group involved in the maintenance of the Jewish HAs. While the Bavarian government and the JDC had disavowed any responsibility for the returnees, as they had already paid to have this group resettled, both groups begrudgingly admitted they would help hardcore cases on an individual basis. And over the course of the 1950s, JDC became involved in several aspects of the returnee issue, while the local Bavarian government helped to provide care for these individuals. In the end, the majority of the returnees were resettled again in Israel, and a handful of them were able to secure visas to new countries of immigration. The West German government worked with JDC officials and the Central Council of Jews in Germany to develop a plausible plan to resettle the HAs in Fernwald who could not emigrate and would remain in Germany, many of whom had suffered from tuberculosis and were ineligible for emigration everywhere except Israel. For their part, German authorities pledged to match the funding provided by JDC and the Claims Conference in an effort to resettle the last of the hardcore Jews. Additionally, the German government stated that it would secure housing and employment opportunities for those who decided to remain in the country, while also providing institutional assistance for those too sick to live without constant care. Unfortunately, the German housing and economic crisis, a post-war carryover, made it impossible to keep these promises. While the German economy began to recover in the 1950s, cities such as Munich, which took the majority of Fernwald's DPs, could not rebuild houses fast enough to replace those destroyed during the war. The severity of the situation was illustrated in late 1953 when the West German government agreed to pay for housing units for 500 camp residents at a time when 1,300 legally registered HAs still needed to be resettled because no additional housing could be found. Housing shortages, combined with the fact that the Jews in Fernwald were so hesitant to leave the camp, meant that the resettlement process was slow at best. Just under 1,000 Jewish HAs remained in Fernwald in early 1954, but the number dropped to 416 residents by April of that year. The majority of the last remaining HAs had begrudgingly agreed to settle in West Germany. The Jews who had signed up for resettlement in Germany clamored to move to their new homes, not because they wanted to leave Fernwald, which continued to be considered a safe community, but because they did not want to be left with nowhere else to go. The continued housing shortages meant that more Jews were signed up to leave Fernwald than there were available houses, causing fear and tension among the HAs. The situation further worsened when the Catholic settlement work and the Archdiocese of Munich-Freising, the center's new owners since 1955, began to take over some of the buildings for renovations. Many social and training programs in Fernwald at this time stopped operating, signaling the center's impending closure, at which point the remaining HAs started to panic about their own resettlement. Although 150 HAs were settled in Munich, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Wiesbaden in February 1956, resettlement really slowed down in the spring. In April of 56, the JDC estimated that it would be able to resettle the majority of the remaining camp residents over the following 2 months, but in actuality, there was almost no movement out of the center during that period. In total, 24 people were resettled in German cities in April and May, with 11 settling in Munich, 12 in Dusseldorf, and 1 in Stuttgart. Although not all of the apartments were ready for the HAs, 174 residences in Munich, Frankfurt, Dusseldorf, Cologne, Hamburg, and Wiesbaden remained empty in April 1956, awaiting the arrival of their new tenants. The liquidation of Camp Fernwald happened quickly once integration began again in the fall of 1956. In the days leading up to the closing of Fernwald, 75 Jews who had called the center home for 12 years exited its gates, bringing with them the, quote, end of the post-Hitler epoch, end quote. The last residents of Fernwald left the center on February 28, 1957. Many of these last HAs had spent 17 years in camps, both during the Shoah and after the end of World War II. Their departure was accompanied by speeches from West German officials, JDC, and Hayes, all marking the monumental nature of the day. There would be no big victory celebration by JDC or the Ministry of the Interior for, as Theodor Feder noted, this would, quote, not make a good impression on the Fernwalders who still have to remain and live in Germany. In his final report on Fernwald, Charles Jordan, JDC Director General for Overseas Operations, noted, quote, when human dignity and self-respect have been so thoroughly destroyed as was theirs, it takes many years of normal and independent living to restore them, end quote. Everyone involved in the care and control of Jewish survivors in Germany hoped the closing of Fernwald would bring with it the chance for these displaced Jews to begin their lives anew. Although they only made up just over 3% of the original 50,000 Jews who had settled in Jewish-only DP camps in Germany in the spring of 1945, the Jewish HAs who remained in Fernwald after 1952, and the even smaller group who were, quote, forced to settle in Germany after the camp's closure continued to grapple with the same issues they had faced upon liberation: fear, uncertainty, a sense of abandonment, a deep-seated need to emigrate, a desire to secure restitution, and a longing for family. While a significant portion of these Jews had been among the first residents of the DP camp system in Germany in early 1945 and 46, their way of thinking no longer resembled that of the DPs who had lived in the camps before 1952. 17 years of this camp life, both as prisoners and as survivors, had transformed these Jews. A number of these HAs had just entered adulthood when the war broke out. Few beyond the elderly had been self-sufficient members of their society before World War II. Instead, camp inhabitants who had lived separated from, quote, normal society experienced constant fear, demoralization, unemployment, and almost total reliance on outside aid for survival. We now know that part of this is PTSD, but at the time, there wasn't mental health care for them. This, combined with years spent waiting for emigration without any control over whether they would get a coveted visa, and the crushing realization that their only chance to leave Germany was through immigration to Israel, an option deemed unacceptable for many, affected every aspect of these Jews' lives. The reality, along with a steadily growing sense of entitlement shared by the final remnant of the HAs, resulted in a group of people who could not fathom that their demands would not be met and who could no longer imagine a future beyond dependency. Health issues and age barred many of these Jews from reaching their desired destinations, but so too did the size of their families, which in many cases had grown over the course of their confinement in DP centers. The group of an estimated 250 children of hardcore HAs had no idea what life was like outside of Fernwald. Their parents had never worked. They thought that supplies such as food and clothing came in large boxes with UNRWA, IRO, or JDC marked on the side, and they only really knew the small community that they had lived within the gates of their centers. Although these children were not expected to leave without their parents, it is understood that they added to the unit's inability to secure emigration abroad. While 1957 marked the end of the Jewish DP era in Germany, it certainly did not result in the resettlement of all Shoah survivors, and some of the last inhabitants opted to move into the remaining, quote, mixed camps active in Germany while they awaited a chance to emigrate, still holding out hope that they'd have some say on their future. And I'm going to go ahead and end it there and open it up for questions, but thank you guys for listening. Jordan, do you want this mic, or are you going to use that mic? Okay.
Yes. Awesome. We're going to start over here, and I promise I will work my way over.
Thank you for that. Could you talk a little about the Jews that found themselves in the Soviet or the French camps and
Yes.
how those differed in the British camps for that matter?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So in the Soviet zone, they actually never recognized Holocaust survivors or Jewish Holocaust survivors as their own victim group. They argued that everyone had been a victim of fascism, so they offered them the same opportunities that they would offer anybody regardless of their experience, and they never really had DP centers. You had communities that came together and that got aid from the Soviet government, but you didn't have like specific camps that separated them out from the rest of the society. The French zone had very, very few Jews, and that was just the way that they divided up the respective zones. And those Jews actually, because there were so few of them, often lived in apartment complexes where they take over the entire apartment, and then that would be the center. In the case of the British zone, the British refused to ever acknowledge the Jews as their own group or as a special victim group. And this was mainly political, because if you admit that the Jews are their own group, then you have to admit that they have the right to their own country. And the Brits were very, very busy overseeing mandatory Palestine. So what happened in that zone is they never had any Jews-only centers that were designated by the British military as Jews-only centers. What happened was that the Jews actually had, most of them in Bergen-Belsen, would move out people that were not Jewish into camps that had a majority of Greek citizens or whatever it was, and then they would take the Jews from there and bring them into the DP center. So it ended up being Jews, but not at all because the government wanted it to be Jews.
Thank you for that very informative presentation. My grandparents took in a Jewish Hungarian family as DPs. Approximately how many Jews from the various countries in Europe came over to the U.S. as DPs, and where did they tend to settle? My grandparents were here in Vienna.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's estimated that somewhere around 80,000 Jews come to the United States, but that's all of Europe. So it's not just displaced persons. And actually the way that it worked was that you had to have a sponsor in the United States who would take you on, and that had a huge financial responsibility that came along with it because the U.S. was worried about having, quote, welfare cases. So if you had a family member who had some plot of land or had a full-time job and said, I can support this person if they aren't able to get on their feet for 2 years, they had a better chance of coming into the United States. And then what happened was, so part of it is where you had family or friends, and you actually had Jews in DP centers that would just read through American phone books, looking for anybody whose name might be familiar, even if they didn't know the person, and reaching out to them and saying, I think you might be a family member. Would you be willing to sponsor us? So you had that a lot. The other thing that happened was that organizations like the JDC and HIAS would sponsor individuals. Like if you were 2 orphan children in your teens, the JDC would say, we will support these teenagers. And a lot of times where they got settled was based on what community was willing to take them. So you have, DPs that end up in Minneapolis, and you have, a lot of them end up in New York because there's already a functioning Jewish community there. A lot of their family members went there. But you have Jews who end up like in the furthest reaches of North Dakota because that community is willing to take Jews into their community. So a lot of it had to do with the community and then with finances.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was born in Bucknang, DP camp.
Yeah.
Can you tell me some things about it?
It's not one of the camps that I study, but I would love to talk to you and learn more about it. I'm sorry I can't give you more. But yes, let's definitely, I would love to do an oral history with you.
So I was born, I think that's in the American zone, and I was born without citizenship.
Yeah, exactly. So after the Harrison report, if you were already living in a DP center or you were born into a DP center, you were automatically a stateless person. Thank you. Stateless?
There was a camp in Oswego called Fort Ontario.
Oh, yes.
In South America, in Chile, they had a Colonia Dignidad and also a Colonia Judía. And there were about 1,000 Germans who refugees settled in Chile, and about 500 that were the adversaries, they were Jewish refugees. Any research on that you have?
Actually, I will put you in contact with a colleague of mine. Her name is Catherine White, and she works on Nazis who resettled in South America and brought with them Nazi tactics into that area. And she talks about their relationships with the Jewish communities. So remind me at the end, I'll give you my card, and then I can put you in contact with her.
So my sister-in-law, who was here this weekend, was born in 1957 in Poland, and her parents were, it seemed like almost smoothly, were Communist Party people who were running Poland, and it was almost like there were so many Jews, survivors in the Communist Party in Poland, and at least according so in any event, in 57, when she was 1 year old, they emigrated to New York City. Now, how they got to do that, I don't really know, and she's never really talked about it much, although she spoke Polish until first grade. But it seems like a lot, and then there was a mass emigration of a lot of her parents' friends in 1967 when the Poles did the next purge of Jews from the Communist Party. And I believe, at least according to one conversation when they were alive that I had with them, this was replicated in a lot of other places, in Hungary, in Romania, even in Yugoslavia. And I just wanted to ask you about that. How many were there, and how did they get, because they didn't have any relatives in the United States, how did they get in? Is there...
So I think the best answer for that is my enemy's enemy is my friend. So a lot of people actually got into the United States before Jews did, because it was believed that Jews and their relationship with the Bundist movement, which is a form of socialism, meant that they were too attached to the Communist Party, right? They wanted communism to take over. And so when they originally, with the Truman Doctrine and then with the first iteration of the DP Act, when they went through people's files, they were trying to identify if they had a relationship with communism. And so the Jews got pushed out. And then the people who end up getting in, so you see a number of Polish Catholics that come in under the Truman Directive and under the DP Act, because they refused to go back to Poland at the end of the war because they didn't want to be under communism. In actuality, most likely they were collaborators and they didn't want to get punished for going back. But then it came down to my enemy's enemy is my friend. And so if they looked and they said, oh, we didn't want to be communist, then they looked like really great applicants for visas. And you do see movement. So in one moment in the post-war period, it's great to be a communist and to be a Jew. But there are purges in the late 1950s, and what I mean by that is murder of Jewish high officials. And it kind of ripples out. And with Hungary in the 1950s, you see in the late 1950s, you see a number of people who had decided to go back to Hungary now ending up in Viennese displaced person centers because they don't feel safe anymore in the country.
A question about the DPs in the Netherlands, and particularly the German Jews who went to the Netherlands because they had maybe already tried to escape to the Netherlands. And then was that required of them to go to the Netherlands, or was that a choice after the war?
You mean in the post-war?
Yes, in the post-war. And second question is, did you find that a lot of the DPs were reluctant to leave Europe because they were still looking for family members and thinking that it would be easier to find, that if they somehow returned, they'd be easier to find if they were still in Europe?
Yeah, so the fervor over finding family you see really in the first 2 or 3 years, and my colleague Susie Snyder is here, so Susie, you can also jump in if you want to add to this. But and then people started to lose hope about finding family. It doesn't mean that they gave up on it, because word of mouth was really huge. And newspaper personal sections in the United States in German, but also in the Yiddish newspapers, ran advertisements looking for family for a really long time, but it wasn't a reason to stay, because by the time that they had a visa opportunity, it's already 1948 if they're lucky. And they've spent those 3 years looking for any trace. So a lot of times what you see when you go through the newspaper archives is that you'll still see like advertisements saying, my mother was last seen in this place, please let me know if you have any idea about what her fate was. So they're still searching, but they don't necessarily feel like they have to be in Europe. And because they've already gone back to their places of residence, before they were ousted, they've tried to contact each other. Searching was huge, even before there was really a search engine, like the ITS or the Red Cross. And when you see pictures of, let's say, the Warsaw Jewish Community Center, people have written on the wall, this is so-and-so, I was here on this date, I am going to this location, please find me. And so people are using any means possible to find their family members, and sometimes, especially with getting a get for marriage that has ended, if you have an eyewitness who says, I saw your spouse last and they were going into the gas chamber, then at least you have some kind of closure. But for a lot of people, you don't have that closure, and actually, way more often than I would ever have thought, because I would have thought that this never happened, but people are in very old age finding family members that they thought, each side thought were dead. What was your first question?
About in the Netherlands.
Oh, yeah, so if you were a Dutch Jew, and you were in a DP center, you didn't have to return if you didn't want to, but the Netherlands really welcomed back their Jews, and it was a fairly safe place for them to go back to and reintegrate in. So if you had been a refugee who was from Germany and ended up there, you could have the option of seeing if they would take you back in, but it wasn't guaranteed. But if you were a Dutch citizen, they welcomed you back with open arms.
Before family moved on to Australia, I knew that they were in possibly North Africa, and they were originally camps from Poland. Were there DP camps in North Africa, to your knowledge?
Not that I know of. I think that the Jewish communities there usually brought them in. I mean, the Jewish community was usually the center that the JDC and HIAS were working with in order to get people resettled. And didn't always necessarily work. Like, I've read cases of Brazil where Brazil said, we'll take your Jews, we need workers. And then a bunch of Jews showed up there, and then they were busily calling out, we need somebody to sort this out, we hadn't anticipated this number. So sometimes it's just a chance to get away from Germany and then to have your foot already out the door if you want to go someplace else. And sometimes it was that you have a family member who lives there, and they help you resettle.
I was born in a DP camp in the American occupation zone. I have three, they're not questions, they're comments, but I would like your reaction. So my father, when he provided information to register in the camp, did not disclose the fact that between 1939 and 41, he was in the Russian-occupied part of Poland. Mm-hmm. And my reasoning, but that's what I'd like to ask you, is that he didn't want to show any connection to Russia in case they would want to repatriate him there, even though that's not where his hometown was, mm-hmm. but he was there. The second thing is that he told me that there was a lot of black market activity out of the DP camps, explained by the fact that residents of the camps had rations, had cigarettes, had coffee, and other items that Germans did not have. And so there was an active black market that the American military occupation forces were trying to eradicate, not with much success. And the third thing is, so since I was born in a DP camp, but in a regular German hospital, mm-hmm. I noted that the birth certificate does not indicate the nationality as Jude, which was the term that Germans would use, but Israelische, mm-hmm. which is more neutral. And your comment about that.
Yeah, so first of all, it's really interesting when you look at DP registration cards to see what people put in and what people leave out. And it's also interesting because sometimes people realize that, like, if somebody can check my history back before the war, I actually was a criminal, but I know so-and-so died, and they will take on new identities. And everybody's CM1 card that they fill out with workers when they register, is like their intent is to figure out how to emigrate as quickly as possible. So you have some massaging, let's say, of what your actual experiences were. And sometimes if you look at documents over a series of years, you see that some of the answers change, because now it's more favorable to have been in this camp than in this camp, you know, whatever it is. So it's very, very common, and it probably is that your dad was savvy enough to realize that the Soviets weren't really great partners, and so better to say that he wasn't in that area. Your second question about the black market, this is actually my specialization, and the black market was huge in post-war Germany, and it's always blamed on the Jews, but it actually started, I mean, the black market always kind of exists in all societies, but the black market really takes up in 1942 when the Germans start to lose the war. And then you have returning Wehrmacht soldiers who are trying to trade things for their families so that they can be taken care of. And what ends up happening is that it's not just that the Jews get real coffee or that they get American cigarettes, that's the currency at the time. But it's also that the Jews are receiving everything in canned tins, and usually they don't have the nourishment that they need to survive. So for example, I interviewed a DP at one point, and she said that part of her rations was oatmeal. But oatmeal, where she's from, which was Russia, was fed to pigs. People didn't eat oatmeal. So she could take that oatmeal, she could change it on the black market for something that she actually needed. And you saw this quite a lot. So a lot of DPs did without what were considered luxury items in the post-war period in order to get fresh meat or vegetables or things like this. So you would have people who got cigarettes, and they were paid by UNRWA and JDC in cigarettes because they understood that that was the currency. And they could take those cigarettes, and I have an example of a guy who he saved up 2 packs of cigarettes. He wanted some fresh some fresh fish. He walked over to Sternberg, which wasn't very far from where he was living in his VP center. He took those 2 packs of cigarettes, he traded it for a pound of fish, came back in the camp. Everybody was so excited about the fish. They wanted fish also, so he collected cigarettes from them. He went and bought a bunch of fish. And then in the end, he opened a fish and meat restaurant in the DP Center that was all based on cigarettes, right? Because I'm telling you, when I read articles, from the contemporary economic articles from the time, they talk about a cigarette passing hands 100 times before anyone could afford to smoke it. And so that's really the only functioning economy. When I write about the black market, I actually, in the first 2 years, call it the gray market, because it's debatable whether or not people have any other option, right? So in the first couple of years, the Allied military kind of turns a blind eye. It's once the Americans, the British, the French start to really make a profit on the black market that then they start to really clamp down on it. And your third question, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's probably a change because everything was stamped with Juda, like your passport and your identification and everything. So it's probably a change to reflect the Jewish nation rather than the Jew as a biological enemy.
I thought it was to differentiate from the Nazi term.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That because everything under the Nazis was stamped with Juda, 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 you wore your star that said Juda, that they probably changed it to Israeli to like Hebraish, right? So like. It's like Hebraish, right? It's the religious connotation. So,
thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Crago Schneider, to Jordan Barry, to Cookie Mandel. There are some light refreshments out in the foyer, so feel free to hang around and be together for a bit. And thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, of course.
That was so interesting.
Oh, I'm glad.